Star Wars Rebels was a serialized TV show rather than an anthology like Star Wars, The Clone Wars, and that difference in format is what made Rebels so special. While the Disney Plus platform has made it so that live-action Star Wars TV shows are now common, Star Wars had already made its mark on TV thanks to the animated series. Clone Wars originally aired for 5 seasons, and it was followed by the release of a similar yet quite different 3D animated series, Star Wars Rebels. George Lucas had always believed Star Wars had a future on TV. That dream started to become reality with Star Wars: Clone Wars, a 2D animated micro-series released after Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones, and before Star Wars Episode III, Revenge of the Sith, that served as a tie-in between the films. Star Wars would then revisit the Clone Wars in 2008 with the Star Wars: The Clone Wars movie and the homonymous TV show. George Lucas handpicked animators and storyboard artists to helm what would become one of the most expensive animated TV shows of the time, with Avatar: The Last Airbender's Dave Filoni leading the team. Dave Filoni almost became George Lucas's apprentice, and while Lucas himself would never be creatively involved with Star Wars again after Disney bought Lucasfilm, Filoni continued to be a key Star Wars creator. One of the first decisions made by Disney upon acquiring Lucasfilm was to cancel Star Wars: The Clone Wars, most likely because the show had become too expensive at that point and because the studio wanted to rearrange the Star Wars canon. Clone Wars had become too lore-heavy, especially thanks to arcs like the Gods of Mortis. Star Wars would not stay away from TV for too long, as Lucasfilm quickly greenlit a new show, Star Wars Rebels, with Dave Filoni serving as one of the executive producers. However, instead of Clone Wars anthology format, Star Wars Rebels was a serialized story focused on a single group of original characters, Ezra Bridger and the crew of the Ghost. That change in format made sure Rebels could be different from Clone Wars right from the start, thus avoiding unfair comparisons between the two shows and allowing Rebels to shine on its own merits. Why Clone Wars had to be an anthology? During an interview for the Star Wars show, Dave Filoni recalled that he did not think he would get to use Anakin and Obi-Wan in Clone Wars and that it was surprising to learn that no Star Wars prequel character would be off-limits. Still, George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and the Clone Wars team were keen on not making the show just an Anakin and Obi-Wan story. Clone Wars was supposed to cover the entirety of the Clone Wars, and thus it would have to follow other characters than just Anakin and Obi-Wan. Clone Wars was the perfect opportunity for Star Wars to explore the several background Jedi from the prequels, not to mention how the show wanted to turn the thousands of clones into actual characters. Therefore, a serialized format would not work for Clone Wars. Not only that, but Clone Wars was a very experimental show in terms of animation techniques, and thus an anthology format would make it easier for Clone Wars to jump from one arc to another if necessary. Rebels couldn't rely on Star Wars movie characters. Shortly after Disney bought Lucasfilm, it became clear that the studio would focus on the Galactic Civil War period, as the idea was to restore what made Star Wars so special in the first place while moving the saga away from the prequels, a controversial decision but that made sense considering how the Star Wars prequels had been received. Therefore, as Star Wars Rebels was set close to the events of A New Hope, there were not many Star Wars movie characters the show could rely on. Luke and Leia would not become actively involved with the rebellion until after A New Hope, and established Jedi like Obi-Wan and Yoda were thought to be dead. As such, unlike Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels had to create a set of original characters to follow. Through the eyes of Ezra Bridger, audiences got to meet the crew of the Ghost, Kanan Jarrus, Hera Syndulla, Sabine Wren, Zeb, and Chopper. Star Wars movie characters like Lando, Leia, and Obi-Wan Kenobi would sometimes appear in Rebels, but the focus was always on the crew of the Ghost. Star Wars Rebels' serialized approach sold its characters. The main reason why the anthology approach worked for Clone Wars is that most of its characters were already well known to the audiences thanks to the Star Wars prequels. Clone Wars did not have to sell its characters to the audiences, but Star Wars Rebels did. Ezra Bridger and the crew of the Ghost were new additions to an already large Star Wars universe, and thus the show had to create a connection between viewers and all those new characters. As such, an anthology approach like Clone Wars would have not worked. Viewers had to constantly follow the crew of the Ghost so that those characters could make their mark on Star Wars, even though the weekly Rebels adventures were slightly self-contained. Still, each Star Wars Rebels season had an overarching story, and even the more filler-like episodes were important to better develop the characters. This would not have been possible with a galaxy-spanning narrative like Clone Wars. Star Wars Rebels' unique story made it more than Clone Wars' replacement. The sudden Star Wars, the Clone Wars cancellation and the announcement of Star Wars Rebels made it seem like the latter was just a replacement for the former. The Clone Wars cancellation was met with a lot of criticism, which already made Star Wars Rebels' mission more difficult. Rebels would always be compared to Clone Wars, which is why it was so important to make the new show as different as possible from Clone Wars. Had Rebels been yet another anthology series now set during the Galactic Civil War, then those comparisons between Rebels and Clone Wars would be even more justified. Star Wars Rebels was indeed a Clone Wars replacement in some ways, but making the show a serialized story rather than an anthology meant that it could offer something unique to the Star Wars franchise. Star Wars Rebels proved that a serialized Star Wars TV show could work, which laid down the path for future series like The Mandalorian and Star Wars: The Bad Batch. Thanks to its serialized approach, it did not take long before Star Wars Rebels found its own identity. Star Wars Rebels characters like Ezra, Kanan, and Sabine went on to become audience favorites, and the show's legacy can now be felt in current live-action Star Wars shows like The Mandalorian and the upcoming Ahsoka. Each in its own way, both Star Wars, The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels ended up redefining the Star Wars franchise thanks to their different methods of storytelling. Key release dates: Rogue Squadron release date, the 22nd of December 2023.